Okay, so last class we talked about effective communication and ways to effectively communicate. And today we're going to be talking about some leaders in effective statistical communication. And so what I want you to do is before you watch this, and so if you haven't already done so, go ahead and pause this lecture and go to Canvas and open up the discussion for today. And I want you to post a little bit about kind of what qualities you think that a leader in effective effective statistical communication would need to have. And then if you can think of some examples of folks that you know of that fit this, maybe you can post about that as well. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a couple examples, and this is definitely not exhaustive. I'm just giving it some examples of types of statistical communicators that use different forms of medium to communicate statistical concepts, and ones that I think that are really effective. And in addition, I've got links to their websites and things so you can find out more information and see other things that they've worked on. So as a reminder, we talked about this space here where we've got kind of, you can classify in the simplistic sense, you can classify statistical communications into one of these four quadrants. And so either not interesting or interesting, and either not true or true. And obviously our target quadrant is this top one here, the true and interesting analyses. And so the people I'm going to be talking about today kind of all fall into this true and interesting quadrant when talking about statistics that either they are themselves generating or that they're explaining for the general public to be able to consume, or maybe for a different audience to be able to consume, and that I think do so very effectively. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about these as examples, and then what I want you to do is maybe go back and try afterwards to add to the discussion to say sort of if there were additional qualities that came up during today's discussion or during today's lecture that you hadn't thought of, you could add those in, as well as if these were ones that you had already thought of, you could sort of mention that as well. So it'll be similar to our last class where we sort of had a pre-discussion and then we'll have a post-discussion. Okay, so the first example I'd like to give is Natalie Dean, and Natalie has been fabulous and really has risen as a effective statistical communicator throughout this pandemic in particular. So Natalie is an assistant professor of biostatistics. She is at the University of Florida, and her area of expertise is infectious disease, and she also does a lot of vaccine efficacy trials. And so her area has been super, super relevant throughout this COVID-19 crisis, and she's really risen to the occasion. And so I want to show you a couple of examples of the type of work that Natalie has done and sort of how it was effective across kind of all of these different quadrants that we're trying to, so both that she's giving true and correct information, but she's packaging it in a way that's very interesting and useful and easy to consume. So as a first example, one of the places that she's really been making a lot of influence or having a lot of influences on Twitter, and she's created several Twitter threads where she has explained complex concepts in pretty easy to understand ways. And so, for example, back in September, she did this thread where she explained vaccine efficacy. And she had these 10 tweets that covered how vaccine efficacy is calculated, distinguishing between infection disease and severe disease, measuring reduced infectiousness, and vaccine efficacy versus effectiveness. And so this was fabulous, obviously very relevant, especially now as a lot of these vaccine trials are coming out. And she was able to hold on to the true pieces, so be able to communicate the statistical truths, while also kind of do it in such a way that was compelling to the viewer. And so I wanted to take you to her website to show you some other examples. She's actually collected several of her Twitter threads that she's put together, and she's linked to these on her website so that you can look through them as well. And so just to sort of pick some out that she's done. For example, here, she highlights a preprint, this is a paper that had come out on transmission dynamics that she really enjoyed. And so what she did here, she wrote this 7-tweet thread to explain what this academic article actually said, and then she was able to also kind of do it in such a way that people who maybe wouldn't access that article directly, so they wouldn't have seen it otherwise, were able to see it. And let's look at some other examples of the types of things that Natalie does. Here's another example where she links to a New York Times article where she basically describes in comparing outbreaks across countries. There's a lot of luck involved in timing, but places that have faced outbreaks in the past have a collective memory and can respond quickly, highlighting a few examples. And so she basically pulls out something that's being seen in the popular press, and then she adds in her 2 cents from what she knows about from a statistical standpoint. Here's another great one that's very statistics relevant. She gives a tutorial on positive predictive value. So positive predictive value is really important. It tells you, given a test result is positive, what are your chances that you're actually infected? And so she has this nice tutorial on that. And so I think Natalie does an excellent job on Twitter right now in particular, but elsewhere as well, of being able to sort of summarize good information. So Natalie is able to summarize really complex topics in these digestible short tweets or these Twitter threads. And what makes her research or her work, her statistical communication really good is that it's able to reach a wider audience and that she holds to the true statistics. And so in addition to making kind of tweets that are going to be interesting and will draw the attention of lots of people, she also is holding true to the statistics at hand. So she keeps the truth piece there. And she does more than just Twitter. This is what, for her, the medium I'm highlighting are her Twitter threads. I encourage you to click on that link and click on her Twitter account to check it out. But she also has made appearances on local news stations, on national news stations. She has written op-eds for the New York Times. She's quoted a lot in local newspapers. And so I think she is a really good example of a very effective statistical communicator who's working in the field. If you're interested, you also can check out her research, which will give you kind of some more information about her ongoing research projects. And this can kind of help you bridge that gap between kind of what she's communicating about on places that are sort of more for a larger audience versus how she would communicate with maybe a smaller audience that has more statistical background. And I think the comparison between the two can be really effective because I think she does a great job in both cases, both when she's talking to people that are experts in the field and when she's talking with the general public. Okay. Another example are Roger Ping and Hillary Parker. So Roger and Hillary have a podcast, Not So Standard Deviations. Roger is a professor at Johns Hopkins in the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Hillary, she's worked for several startups. She worked for Etsy, and then she worked for Stitch Fix, and then she actually left Stitch Fix a couple months ago, and she worked for the Biden campaign as one of their data scientists. And so both of them have very strong statistical chops. Hillary got her PhD in biostatistics at Johns Hopkins before working in data science. But they host this popular podcast called Not So Standard Deviations, which is another very effective way to communicate about kind of statistical concepts, data science concepts, and sort of what's going on generally in the field. And so you can click on this Not So Standard Deviations link, and you can see their recent episodes. There was an episode, their last one that dropped was on election night data science, and so Hillary talked all about kind of what her experience was there on working as a data science project manager for the Biden campaign. And you can see kind of other examples of different things that they've discussed on their podcast that I think this one on data analytic pitfalls is excellent for sort of talking about where things can go wrong in data analysis and provides really excellent context for that. So I encourage you to look through these and potentially consider listening to one or two to sort of hear about how folks who have kind of really strong statistical skills are able to sort of translate or talk about them in kind of simple verbiage on something like a podcast. I think this is an excellent medium for being able to bring statistics to the forefront and make it interesting. Another example is Regina Nutso. So she is a senior advisor for statistics, communication, and media innovation at the American Statistical Association. She's a journalist. She also has a PhD in statistics, and she has a really strong track record of creating just excellent statistical communication tools. The one that I've pulled here is she worked with an artist to create a comic strip that described statistical pitfalls that can happen in courtrooms. And so when evidence is being presented in a courtroom, so here she showed this statistician Hal Stern at the University of California, Irvine, and basically is describing some of the tools that have helped crime experts called a likelihood ratio. And likelihood ratio is a very common statistical tool, and she's able to basically describe this in an easy to understand way that holds on to the truth but keeps it interesting. And so she's got this scale here, the probability of evidence given the defense claim and the probability of evidence given the prosecution claim, and how you can kind of balance that evidence. So this is just one example. Regina's done tons of different, she writes a lot for different news agencies and kind of for different sets of audiences, and she does an excellent job of adapting her statistical communication depending on who she's talking to. And she also does an excellent job marketing her statistical communication. For example, I think this is a very clever way to get this information out there. So I'm going to click here so you can see some other examples that she has. When courtroom science goes wrong and how stats can fix it, an illustrated feature story. That's the one that I was just looking at. But she also has a lot of other under her selected writings. She's got a lot of other pieces here. She's written for the New York Times, for example. She's written for several different Scientific American, the New Scientist, etc. So these are some nice examples of different writings that she's done, and I encourage you to kind of click through a couple of them if you'd like, or you can click on her CV. And if you go, first of all, I think it's interesting just to look, and let's just take a look at what she's done so far. So her PhD was from Stanford in statistics, and then she was a graduate student assistant, an instructor, a postdoc fellow, and then now is a professor in the Department of Science, Technology, and Mathematics, and also the Department of Psychology. But she also has a lot of communication experience, and so she's been a freelance journalist and writer, a science writer, a science journalism fellow, and consultant for several different groups, and so she's got a lot kind of from that. So here I think this is where, this section here I think would be where it'd be interesting to sort of look at different features that she's done, for example, in this popular press section that shows some different examples of her writing. And so she does a great job, I think, of sort of balancing, making sure that statistics are correct, but also keeping it very interesting. And so you can also see, of course, her referee journal articles, which these are going to be more geared towards academic audiences. And similar to what I was saying with Natalie, it's interesting sometimes to be able to read some of the other work that she's done to see kind of the discrepancy or the difference between how she would present something if she was presenting for a academic audience versus how she would for a general audience. And then finally, I want to talk about Danielle Witten. So I love Danielle is fabulous. She is a chair of math stats at University of Washington. She's also a professor of statistics and biostatistics there. And she is one of the co-authors of your book. And so she is an excellent statistical communicator in a large variety of ways, but one of them is that she wrote this textbook that I think communicates statistical concepts really, really well. And so she is on this An Introduction to Statistical Learning book. You'll notice her name right here, Danielle Witten. And she also, we can go to her website, she has a lot of other means by which she communicates statistical learning concepts effectively. And so I think even just her website is beautiful. She's got kind of a great way of sort of demonstrating the type of research that she does and describing it in a way that's easy to understand. She's got some of her more recent publications that were more for academic audiences that you can read. And you also can see where she's been quoted in the news recently. And so that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of the types of things that she does. In addition, you can see she also is on Twitter. So like Natalie, she uses Twitter as kind of a mechanism to be able to communicate. And I encourage you to sort of look at some of the statistical communication pieces that she has there as well. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to choose one of actually 4. We discussed 4, and actually one had 2, so 5. Choose one of the 5 leaders discussed, or pick a new one, and find one example of a statistical communication that they have produced. And I want you to talk about how this demonstrates their leadership in the field. And so I want you to go back to that original discussion, and in addition to sort of talking about broadly sort of what characteristics of a leader are necessary, I then want you to find an example of a leader. So you can either use one that I've given or pick a new one. And then I want you to, after you've picked the person, I want you to pick an example of a statistical communication, not one that was discussed today, so a different example than one that I gave that they've produced. And I want you to talk about how this demonstrates their leadership in the field.